there's a particular kind of grief that arrives not with noise, but with a door quietly closing. David would later think about that party, not the kiss he witnessed, but the moment just before it, when Sophie had laughed at something the man said and touched his arm in a way that was entirely too familiar. He had seen that gesture before. He simply hadn't known, until then, what it meant. This is the story of David Callum Hartley and his wife Sophie Marie Hartley. They had been married for 11 years, long enough for their routines to become a kind of language, long enough for silence between them to carry weight without either of them having to name it. Their marriage had not been unhappy exactly. It had been something quieter and more complicated than unhappiness, a slow settling, like a house adjusting to its own foundation, where certain doors no longer opened all the way and neither of them mentioned it. The emotional core of what they had was real. It had been real. But somewhere in the years between their early 30s and now, they had each retreated into private versions of themselves that the other had stopped trying to fully reach. David knew this. Sophie knew it too. They simply never said so aloud, because saying so would have required a kind of courage that felt, in the ordinary texture of their days, unnecessary. The morning of Richard Okafor's birthday party, David stood at the kitchen window drinking his coffee while Sophie moved behind him, opening the refrigerator, closing it, setting something on the counter. They had developed over the years a comfortable choreography in the kitchen. Neither of them had to think about it. That was what David had always liked about it. The ease. "We should leave by 7, Sophie said. "Richard gets anxious when people arrive late." "We've never arrived late." "I know. I'm just saying." She was already dressed, though the party wasn't for another 4 hours. That was Sophie. She prepared in stages, early and methodically, so that by the time an event arrived she appeared effortlessly ready. David had always found this quality admirable. Lately he found himself watching it from a greater distance than he used to, as though he were observing a habit rather than a person. Their daughter, Nora, 8 years old and deeply interested in the structural integrity of things, was at Sophie's mother's for the weekend. The house felt larger without her. David noticed that he and Sophie spoke differently when Nora wasn't home, more carefully, with longer pauses, as though without her as a natural subject of conversation, they had to find their way back to each other from scratch. "The Morrisons are going to be there," Sophie said, coming to stand beside him at the window with her own mug. "Claire and Pete." "Good. I like Pete. You barely know Pete's." "I know enough." He smiled at her, and she smiled back. And it was a real smile. He wanted to be clear about that, even in hindsight. It was real. The warmth between them had not entirely cooled. It had simply receded, like a tide that goes out so gradually you don't notice the waterline has changed, until you're standing much farther from the sea than you thought you were. Richard Okafor's house was a renovated Victorian on Ashford Lane, and by the time David and Sophie arrived, it was already bright with people and music played at a volume just low enough to talk over. Richard was the kind of man who hosted well, attentive, without being suffocating. The sort of person who remembered what you drank and what you did for work and asked follow-up questions from previous conversations. David respected him. It was at Richard's party that David first noticed the man. His name, he would later learn, was Philip Stroud, a colleague of Sophie's from the architecture firm, though David had heard his name only once before. Briefly, in the context of a project. He was tall, angular, with the particular self-possession of someone who had decided some time ago that he was interesting and had not yet been seriously contradicted. When Sophie introduced them near the drinks table, Philip shook David's hand and said something pleasant about having heard good things. And David said something equally pleasant in return, and that was that. The party moved the way parties do, in clusters and dispersions. Brief conversations and longer ones. Rooms filling and emptying. Around 9:30, David went looking for the downstairs bathroom. He tried 2 doors before he found the right one. The first opened onto a coat closet. The second, and this is the part he would return to, quietly, for weeks, opened onto a short hallway that led to what appeared to be Richard's study. And in the amber light from a lamp left on inside, he saw Sophie. She was facing away from him. Philip Stroud was not. The kiss lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Neither of them made a sound. David stood in the doorway long enough for the image to complete itself in his mind. and then he stepped back and closed the door softly behind him. He found the bathroom. He stood at the sink with the water running and looked at his own face in the mirror for a long time. When he returned to the party, Sophie was already back in the living room, laughing with Claire Morrison about something, her hand around her glass. She looked up when he approached and touched his arm briefly. The same arm, the same instinct, and said, "There you are. We were just talking about that restaurant on Pemberton Street." "Right," David said. "The one with the terrible bread." Sophie laughed. "The terrible bread," she confirmed. He stayed for another hour. He drove them home. He said goodnight to his wife, and she kissed him on the cheek in the hallway and went upstairs. And David stood alone in the kitchen for a while in the dark, not yet ready to name what he was carrying. In the days that followed, David did something that surprised even him. He said nothing. He was not by nature a man who suppressed things. He was not dramatic, but he was direct, or had been, once, in the earlier years when directness between him and Sophie had felt safe and necessary. What stopped him now was not fear exactly. It was something more like the need to understand what he had seen before he decided what to do with it. He began paying attention differently. He noticed the angle of Sophie's phone when she sat beside him on the sofa, always slightly away from his eyeline, not dramatically so, just by a few degrees. He noticed that she had started replying to messages in the bathroom, which she hadn't done before. He noticed that she mentioned Philip Stroud's name once, casually, in the context of a deadline at work, and that she did not look at David when she said it. None of these things were proof of anything. He knew that. He also knew what he had seen. He called his oldest friend, Martin, on a Thursday evening when Sophie was at a late meeting. He didn't tell Martin what had happened, not yet, but he talked around it, in the way men sometimes do, speaking about the general texture of a marriage without locating its specific wound. "You ever feel like," David started, "like you and Diane are having two different conversations at the same time? Like, there's the one you're actually having, and then there's the one underneath it that neither of you is saying?" Martin was quiet for a moment. "Most of the time," he said. "Is something going on?" "I don't know yet," David said. "I'm trying to figure that out." He began, in the evenings after Nora went to bed, to sit with the question of how long. Not out of obsession, but out of a precise and almost clinical need to understand the actual dimensions of the thing. He thought about the way Philip had touched Sophie's shoulder at the party. Not during the kiss, but before it, the casual, proprietary ease of it, and recognized that as the gesture of someone who had touched her before. He thought about the weekend 2 months ago when Sophie had gone to Bristol for what she'd described as a work retreat. He thought about the evenings she'd stayed late at the office, which had been increasing since autumn, which he had attributed to a busy period at the firm. He thought about the way she'd seemed, during those months, slightly more alive, brighter, as though lit from inside, and how he had registered this but told himself it was the project, the pressure, the professional satisfaction she had always needed and had sometimes complained he didn't understand. He had not understood. That much was becoming clearer. One Wednesday morning, he watched Sophie make Nora's packed lunch, cutting the crusts from her sandwich the way Nora liked, tucking in a small note the way she'd done since Nora started school. And he felt something break open in him very quietly, like a seam giving way. Not anger. Not yet. Something more fundamental, the collision of who Sophie was with what she had done, and the slow recognition that these were not opposites but the same person entirely. That evening, Sophie put her hand on his arm across the dinner table. They were talking about Nora's school project on the water cycle, and said, "You've been somewhere else this week." David looked at her. "Have I?" She tilted her head slightly. "Work? Probably," he said. She nodded, accepting this, and went back to helping Nora with her diagrams. David watched them both and felt the particular loneliness of being the only person in a room who knows a truth that changes everything. He found Philip Stroud's name on Sophie's firm's website that night. He read the profile without expression. He closed the laptop and went to bed. He had not yet decided what to say. He was waiting, he realized, for the right moment. Not a dramatic one, but a true one. He was waiting for Sophie to give him the opening because some part of him needed her to be the one to bring them to the edge of it. He understood this was not rational. He understood it anyway. The family gathering was at David's parents' house on the last Saturday of October. his parents' 40th anniversary, a casual lunch that had expanded over the planning weeks into something slightly more formal. His sister Joanna and her husband, his cousin Paul, an aunt who had driven up from Salisbury, Sophie's mother Eleanor invited as she usually was. It was in the kitchen, just the two of them, briefly, while David refilled the water glasses. That Sophie said it. "You've been distant. Not just this week. Weeks now." She wasn't accusing him. Her voice was low and measured, the voice she used when she was concerned but trying not to escalate. "I'm not saying it to start something. I just think we should talk." David set the water pitcher down. He turned to look at her. Really look at her. And Sophie met his eyes with an expression he recognized as genuine worry, which was the thing that made it so difficult. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been distant since the night you kissed him." The room did not change. The sounds from the dining room continued. His father saying something, Joanna laughing, but Sophie's face went through something that David would think about for a long time afterward. Not guilt first, but a strange, suspended quality, as though the sentence had arrived before her mind could prepare for it. "David, I'm not doing this here." His voice remained even. He picked up the water pitcher. "Not in my parents' kitchen." "When?" Her voice was almost a whisper. "Tonight. When we get home." He walked back into the dining room. He refilled the glasses. He sat beside his mother and listened to his aunt describe a trip to the Algarve. And he was present enough, his face composed, his responses adequate. But something in him had folded inward, some protective architecture clicking quietly into place. Sophie barely ate. No one appeared to notice, except perhaps Eleanor, who watched her daughter with the sideways attention of a mother who knows her child's distress signals. On the drive home, Nora fell asleep in the back seat within minutes. David drove. Sophie looked out the passenger window. The silence between them was not the ordinary silence of their marriage. It was dense, specific, like a room with all the oxygen used up. At home, once Nora was in bed and the house was quiet, they sat in the living room, Sophie on the sofa, David in the chair opposite, the lamp between them. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since Richard's party." She closed her eyes. "How long has it been going on?" he asked. He kept his voice level. He had rehearsed this, in a sense. Not the words, but the register. He did not want to perform his pain. He wanted to understand. Sophie was quiet for a moment. 7 months. He nodded slowly. Something settled in him. Not relief, but the grim satisfaction of a number confirming what he had already suspected. "Did you want to end the marriage?" he asked. "Were you planning?" "No." Her voice was immediate, and then she caught herself, as though recognizing the inadequacy of that quickness. "I don't know. I wasn't thinking that far." "What were you thinking?" She looked at her hands. "I don't know how to explain it without it sounding like an excuse." "Try." She exhaled slowly. "I felt like I'd disappeared," she said. I know how that sounds. I'm not blaming you. But I felt like I'd been invisible for a long time and he noticed things. That's all. It's not an excuse." "I know it's not," David said, and he meant it. Not generously, but honestly. He had thought about this. He knew what she was describing was a real feeling, even if what she'd done with it was not something he could absorb. "David, I think," he said carefully, "that I need some time." They did not shout. They did not cry, at least not then, not in front of each other. He moved into the spare room that night, and in the morning they made breakfast and got Nora ready for school, with the particular precision of two people holding a shared thing very carefully above a hard floor. By February, David was living in a rented flat on Clement Street, 2 rooms, a view of a brick wall, a kitchen that he slowly stocked with the things he actually liked, rather than the things that had accumulated in a shared life. He found, to his own surprise, that he was not undone by it. He had expected a more dramatic grief. What came instead was quieter, and in some ways harder. A persistent, low-frequency loneliness, and a kind of reckoning with the person he had been inside the marriage. He began seeing a therapist, a practical, unsentimental woman named Dr. Frances Obi, who had a habit of letting silences stretch until David filled them himself. In their early sessions, he talked mostly about Sophie, about what she had done, about the months of not knowing. Dr. Obi listened without judgment and then said, gently, "What about before that? What were you like in those years with her?" This was not what David had come to talk about. He talked about it anyway. He talked about the evenings he had come home from work and gone straight to his study. He talked about the way he had stopped asking Sophie about her projects. Once they had Nora. Assuming the conversation had shifted, that they had both shifted into a new arrangement. He talked about the night, 2 years ago, that Sophie had told him she felt underestimated at home, that she sometimes felt he saw her only as a function, and how he had listened and then let the conversation fall away without really acting on it. He had thought he'd understood. He saw now that he had heard without listening, which is a different thing entirely. "I'm not responsible for what she did," he said in one session. And Dr. Curson, Obi said, "No, but you're responsible for your part of the shape the marriage took." He sat with that for a long time. Sophie he learned from Joanna, who remained carefully neutral and relayed information only when directly asked, had ended things with Philip in November. Whether this was a decision made from principle or from consequence, David didn't know and found he couldn't bring himself to find out. What Joanna also said without being asked was that Sophie seemed less herself lately. Quieter, Joanna said, like something's working itself out inside her. Sophie had started seeing someone too. A therapist, David presumed, though Joanna didn't say. She had told Eleanor most of what had happened. Eleanor, by Joanna's account, had been harder on Sophie than anyone expected, which David found he felt nothing about, particularly, neither satisfaction nor guilt. Just a kind of weariness. He spent some weekends in the early months replaying the party in his mind, not the kiss itself, but the hour before it, himself standing at the drinks table while Sophie moved through Richard's living room, easy and bright in a way she hadn't been around him for months. He had noticed it that night and attributed it to the social occasion. He understood now that he had been attributing many things to convenient alternative explanations for a long time. Nora stayed with Sophie during the week, and with David on alternate weekends. She had taken the separation with a child's particular combination of sensitivity and pragmatism. She asked clear questions and accepted clear answers, and seemed, mostly, to be managing. David watched her carefully, the way he watched everything carefully now, and loved her with an intensity that sometimes felt like the clearest thing in his life. In late January, late on a Tuesday evening, he got a message from Sophie. It was brief. "Nora mentioned you've been teaching her chess. She's obsessed. Thank you for that." He stared at it for a while. Then he typed, "She's good at it. Better than me already." That was all. But he sat with the warmth and the sorrow of it together, and did not try to separate them. They met in March, at a coffee shop midway between their respective addresses. Neutral ground, chosen without discussion, simply proposed by Sophie in a message and agreed to by David by return. There were practical things to discuss. The house, which would need a decision by spring. Nora's summer schedule. The ordinary administrative residue of a life being disassembled. Sophie was there before him. She looked, David thought, both different and entirely herself. Thinner, perhaps, or maybe only less padded by the ordinary comforts of a shared life. She'd cut her hair slightly shorter. She was wearing a coat he didn't recognize. He sat down. She had ordered him a coffee without asking because she still knew how he took it, and that small fact sat between them like a stone. "Thank you for coming," she said. Of course. They went through the practical things first, carefully, like people diffusing something. The house. David didn't want to force a sale while Nora was still in her school year. Sophie agreed. They would revisit in summer. The schedule. There were 2 weeks in August to account for, and a school trip that needed a signed form from both of them. When they had finished, there was a pause of perhaps 30 seconds, the kind that would once have been filled automatically, the way long married couples fill silences without thinking. Now neither of them filled it. "I've been thinking," Sophie said finally, "about what I want to say to you. I've been thinking about it for months." She looked down at her cup. "I'm not sure any version of it is adequate." "You don't have to. I know." She looked up. "But I want to. What I did, I'm not going to try to explain it again. I've explained it to myself so many times now that the explanation is starting to feel like a story I tell, rather than a truth. What I know is that I hurt you, and that I hurt Nora, and that I hurt something between us that deserved better than what I gave it. David listened. He did not make it easier for her by saying it was all right, because it wasn't all right, and they both knew that. And saying so would have been its own small condescension, the kind of softening that looks like kindness but is actually just a refusal to let the weight land. I think, he said slowly, that we both deserved better than what we gave each other. I'm not saying that to make you feel better. I'm saying it because I've been thinking about it, and I think it's true. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise, but close to it. I wasn't there, he said. I don't mean I was absent. I was there, I was present for the day-to-day. But I wasn't paying attention. Not to you specifically. Not to what you were actually needing. He paused. I noticed you were brighter those months. I told myself it was work. Sophie was quiet. I didn't want to look at what it might actually mean, he said. That's mine to carry. Outside the coffee shop, the street held its ordinary March business, people passing with coats pulled against the wind, a delivery van double parked. The light, the particular flat gray of late winter beginning to soften toward spring. Inside, they sat with the ruin of something that had once been good, and the strange, difficult grace of being able to say so honestly. What happens now? Sophie asked. It was not a plea, it was a genuine question. I don't know, David said. I think we figure out how to be good at the parts that matter. For Nora. Eventually. Maybe. For ourselves. Sophie nodded. She seemed to be considering whether there was something more to say. And arriving at the same place David had arrived at months ago, that there is a point past, which words begin to substitute for acceptance. And acceptance is harder, but more honest than anything you can say. They finished their coffee. They put on their coats. They walked out together and stood for a moment on the pavement before going in opposite directions, and Sophie said, Tell Nora I'll call her tonight. And David said, I will. And that was how it ended. Not with anything that could be called resolution, but with the two of them going back to the separate lives they were still learning to inhabit, carrying everything that had happened as something to be lived with rather than solved. David walked to his car. He sat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about a morning, years ago, early in the marriage, Nora not yet born, when he and Sophie had driven out to the coast on impulse and sat on the sand with fish and chips from a paper bag, the wind being unmanageable and neither of them caring. He had been fully present that morning in a way he had lost track of how to be. He thought about that, not with bitterness and not with longing exactly, but with the sober, weighty acknowledgement of someone counting what they had spent without noticing and finding the sum. He started the car. He drove home through the gray March afternoon, and the city moved around him as it always had, indifferent and continuous. And somewhere in it, Sophie was driving her own way home, and Nora was at school learning things they would never know about, and the world kept arranging itself into the shape of whatever came next.